Hey, there we are. Welcome, everybody, to Antigen Security's Fireside Chat here with Joe Stocker. Joe is the CEO of Patriot Consulting Group, Microsoft MVP, and all-around great guy. Joe, do you want to add anything to my completely inadequate introduction there?
No, thank you so much, Stephen. It's an honor to be with you. I'm excited for today's discussion.
Excellent, excellent. Just as a side note for anybody who's joining us, Joe actually just recently authored a book. Joe, do you want to hold up the book
Thank you.
so people can see it?
Yeah, so this is something I've been wanting to do for many years. Securing Microsoft 365 is really all about hardening the identity, the email, and the device, which are really in my opinion, the top three considerations especially in this kind of cloud first world, as organizations are moving away from on-premise Active Directory and trying to go towards zero trust model.
Mm-hmm.
This is just in my experience, some tips and best practices, and then there's a lab guide in the back that can actually help you build a complete solution from end to end using Microsoft technology. So that's kind of my area of specialization, is all things Microsoft. So it's a Microsoft first kind of approach. Not to say that there's not other great solutions out there, but a lot of companies now do own the Microsoft Office 365. So just basically using tools you maybe already purchased to help secure your digital assets, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I can say from experience on the incident response side, we work with a lot of customers that have various Microsoft technologies, and many of them can benefit from buying in a little bit more and integrating some of those security features and tool sets that exist. And your book's a great way to address that, regardless of what angle you're coming at it from.
Thank
So
you.
really
Appreciate it.
appreciate you joining us today. Um, so Joe, to kick things off, I mean, there's a lot of things we can talk about. But I think one interesting topic in particular, and something I want to get your perspective on, what do you think about the recent announcement of bounties
Yeah.
up to $10 million for information leading to the arrest of ransomware gangs? What does that say to you?
It's a fantastic development, in my opinion, because honestly, I felt like businesses were getting picked apart. We were kind of sitting ducks for a long time. It's really hard to stand up against, these gangs that have access to zero-day marketplaces where, if you spend $1 million, you get a zero-day, and you're basically almost guaranteed entry into most places. And, so the fact that we actually have bounties can create, a perception of, I guess maybe giving the gangs a second thought about what they're doing, that, hey, I might be punished for this. And the fact that we've actually seen at least 7 major arrests, in particular, in just one, ransomware gang. I believe the Revel gang has had like 7 arrests. It's,
Hmm.
it's very significant. And I think what's driving it are these bounties, because it's kind of brilliant if you think about it. The government basically identified, okay, these people are motivated by money. Clearly, it's ransomware, right? They get it. So by putting out, a pretty sizable, option there, I bet some of these attackers are basically doing the math and going, I could probably retire off that, and I don't have to, do a life. I just need to turn in some guy I don't even know. So it's not like there's loyalty, among these guys, right? There's no honor among thieves here, right? These are
Hmm.
criminals, right? So for them, $5 million, they're probably doing the equation. I'm going to turn someone in. Everybody wins here. Obviously, taxpayers are putting some money out here. But I think if you can actually put fear in someone that, hey, I don't know if I could trust this person in this private chat. We're talking about going after a business, but they could turn me in. Just that potential is, I think, a really positive development, because for the last couple of years, there's really been no threat of extradition or punishment for any of these crimes.
Hmm.
And so this is a step in the right direction to protect businesses, in my opinion.
Yeah, no, I agree, and I think breaking the precedent and the message to the world that, oh, you'll pay, and starting to break down that culture is another critical blow that this dealt.
Yeah.
Um, I don't know personally how you feel. It sounds like we probably feel the same about this, but uh, in general, when we consult with customers that are dealing with ransomware, paying the ransom is an absolute last resort. Like you should
Right.
never do that unless you absolutely have to,
Right.
because you truly are funding crime, right? That
Right.
money gets attached to just about every kind of major organized crime out there in the world, and those groups all kind of drink from the same troughs. So,
And the U.S. Department of Treasury put out a memo, I think about a year, maybe 2 years ago. They basically said that if you pay a ransom and that ransom is linked to a terrorist organization,
mhm,
the U.S. government will come after you. And
yeah,
so this is now a factor, especially when attribution, is pointing at some of these groups being affiliated with terrorism. Uh, you can't pay the ransom unless you're willing to go to jail or whatever. So this actually puts businesses in a very tough spot when
mhm,
the backups have been deleted and they're facing permanent data loss, right? Which could mean going out of business or significant issues, or paying the ransom. Now, if they pay the ransom, if there's attribution that this could be a terrorist organization, the State Department's like, hey, we're going to actually come after you. You could
mhm.
go to jail. You could face fines. And as far as I know, they're the only U.S. government entity that has kind of come out with that stance. The FBI sent a memo, I think it maybe the year prior, really kind of almost loosening that policy a little bit. Their position was, hey, we understand if you have to pay. I mean, it wasn't like that, but it was softer than the previous messaging, which was like never pay, never pay. They kind of softened their stance maybe a year prior to that memo.
Yeah, not to soothsay too much, because I think a conversation about people's intentions gets interesting and inaccurate really quickly. But my guess is that that initial communication was more aimed at the insurance industry and a lot of the people that were kind of towing the line on that side, right, and encouraging it almost. And you even saw that from other security companies. It was very alarming for a while there.
That's
But
right.
I'm happy to see it. I agree with you. I think that that does represent kind of a turning of that tide, and is having that effect. So it's good to see.
Mhm.
Um, in terms of what we're seeing. Speaking of attribution, uh, in particular, I don't know if you've had any interesting kind of tales from the field, or things that have come up that have been noteworthy to you. But I think one that is worth talking about, especially since you're a Microsoft expert, is Exchange, and
Mm.
the overwhelming and continued precedent and announcements around vulnerabilities in the Exchange ecosystem. Not that there's anything wrong with the technology, but man, you really need to be able to secure it if you deploy it. What are your experiences with it, dealing with Exchange?
Yeah, if you have a internet facing Exchange server today, I really feel for those administrators because I'm assuming a lot of them would prefer to get that up in Exchange Online where it's Microsoft's problem to patch and defend.
Yep.
But for those organizations, for whatever reason, if it's the year 2021 and they have not moved their email to Office 365, they're probably going to be staying on prem for a while by now. All right, everyone's
Mhm.
got the memo about Exchange Online and how admins don't have to work every weekend to patch and back up and whatnot. And I could tell you as a former admin, just getting the work life balance back after moving to the cloud has been a pretty significant blessing for
Mhm.
sure. But these administrators and these network teams and security teams that are trying to defend a internet facing Exchange server this year over the last 12 months, I mean, we're talking about typically losing your holiday weekend plans because attackers know that that's when these small businesses that don't have a 24/7 SOC are basically taking time off, so they won't be as quick to respond. And so most of them have had to work these long weekends. Um, I think if I were working at one of those organizations, Stephen, I'd probably outside of just SMTP being filtered by an external gateway, I probably would do whatever it took to put that behind a VPN or some other appliance. I don't know. I'd be feeling very good about any kind of internet facing OWA or ActiveSync or anything like that at this point.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think whether you're using the tools in Azure, or whatever kind of web application filtering you're doing, um, you really need some kind of protection at the edge to curtail some of what can be done with those internet-facing servers for sure. I think that's probably one of the most common follow-on actions in breaches we've dealt with that have involved Exchange as a vector.
I think the question that I haven't seen asked yet is why are the Exchange Online servers, which are fundamentally the same version of Exchange that everyone else is running, right?
Mm-hmm.
Why are they immune? Why haven't they been hit yet? That's an interesting question. The assumption is that Microsoft has access to the vulnerabilities and they could patch their stuff before everyone else. But that raises some really interesting ethical questions, right? It's like if they knew that they were financially incentivized to sort of like not patch as quickly these on-prem servers so that people had to go to the cloud, that's, not saying that's happening, but that's sort of, an interesting question. Why aren't these, Exchange Online servers getting hit with the same attacks?
Well, I can't. Again, I'm not a soothsayer, but I can't read minds. But my guess is that Microsoft probably does get beat up on the regular. But as you said, they have a lot of eyes on those entry points. They likely have a lot of other proactive measures in place to filter out the low hanging fruit at least. And given the language and a lot of their services agreements and whatnot, they keep a pretty tight lock on most of that stuff. I think it does raise some questions about both ethics, but also the efficacy of some of those measures and what it really takes to secure that kind of technology. But really, at the end of the day, I think strategically what they want to see happen is have more people put that weight on their shoulders and not take as much of it on themselves.
Mhm.
um, Again, like coming from engagements that we've done that again involve Exchange as a vector in a breach, I think that's one of the most common things that we see is migrating off of on-premise servers. And in many cases the only real barriers or hangups are not so much from a service and support perspective. It's more from like third-party add-ins or other business operations that have been integrated with Exchange in some way, but maybe they lack the
Mhm.
engineering support or kind of technical know-how to adapt those things to the Microsoft cloud.
Yeah, I'm sure we could actually probably do an entire hour on just the reasons why people haven't migrated by now. I think some of the top reasons are probably lack of trust. I know some law firms are concerned about their clients' intellectual property,
Hmm.
Microsoft having access to the data if it's in the cloud. And Microsoft does have some interesting technology to deal with that. They actually have something called double key encryption, Stephen, where the customer can actually host an encryption key. And they actually have a perimeter DMZ solution where, as long as Microsoft can make a connection to read that key, then the customer's data can be read and accessed, by the service, by Exchange Online. But if you ever wanted to revoke your key, you just basically shut off that DMZ connection, and the data is bricked in the cloud. So very difficult to implement. It's sophisticated, it's challenging, and I wouldn't recommend it for anything other than, say, an IP law firm or someone with a tremendous amount to lose,
Hmm.
because the trade-off is then the data literally cannot be read by a DLP policy, by a transport rule, by a lot of the things we take for granted in a SaaS application, because the data is effectively, it's bricked, it's unreadable.
Hmm. Yeah, you've
Um,
masked it all.
yeah, you've masked it all. So a lot of people are like alerted by that. Oh, I don't trust Microsoft, so let me go with this double key encryption. But it's actually, there's a big trade off to implementing something like that.
Well, and I would say a lot of times when you're considering security measures, it often is a double-edged sword, right? And you're making a trade-off.
Mhm.
So I think to your point, the people that care about that are people that are going to have a ton of IP to protect or
Mhm.
proprietary data that is of great risk and business value to them, like those law firms that you mentioned. Um,
Yeah. But as
so.
far as tales from the field, I've got one that I think you might find really interesting. This global organization was monitoring. They had a system set up to monitor their internet circuit. So, for example, when something would reach 95%,
Mm.
was that somebody surfing YouTube and basically denial of servicing everybody else, or what was going on, right? So, it was a standard alert. They were investigating it, and they realized, okay, this is not download. This is upload. This is odd, and they saw data leaving I think it was their McAfee kind of edge server.
Mm.
So the hackers had figured out if they could basically stage data on this McAfee server, which is quite ironic that it's a security server, but it's being used as a staging point because it was one of the very few servers that had egress connection to the internet. And so they basically staged all the data that they were collecting for double extortion, right? After all the files are ransomed, they basically threaten to leak the data, to the public if you don't pay. So it's this kind of double extortion concept. So the hackers were in the process of basically, prior to ransoming everything, they were trying to basically export everything. And the alert that informed the whole organization that something was off was this internet pipe was saturated. And so I thought that was a very interesting kind of early warning, almost a quasi, IOC, probably something to take a look at. Get your net flows, turned up for specifically egress, because that could be somebody who's trying to take all your data right prior to ransomware. So what they did, I loved their response. They shut everything down, and that saved them, because had they not done that, because this was actually most likely, in my opinion, this was actually DarkSide at the time before they went through their rename based on their TTPs. They had all sorts of areas of persistence and ways and multiple accounts and different things, backdoors kind of ready to go. And it really took, a pretty intense investigation to basically find all that stuff out. I have a lot more to kind of share on that. It's a very interesting kind of story, but I did like that the tweak of monitoring the egress as a sign of, hey, right before ransomware, they're typically going to try to take your data to, threaten to publish it all, right? So that was interesting.
Yeah, no, that's a really good tell. Also, that's something forensic we look for to establish whether an exfiltration event happened. So that's a really good kind of starting point, and great IOC for folks that have to monitor those kind of technologies. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Um,
And I've got a couple more, unless you want to jump in with one. Go
no,
ahead
no,
if you haven't.
go
Okay.
go ahead.
So
Keep rolling.
another really interesting. This is when Microsoft Defender for Endpoint first came out. And at the time when it first was released, it did not have the tamper protection feature.
Mm,
And so what was happening back then, if you remember the what was called the triple threat, it'd be, typically like Emotet and then TrickBot and then Ryuk, right? It was this kind of triple threat, and which, Emotet is back, unfortunately.
yeah.
But essentially what happened was, the Emotet came in the form of like a Microsoft Word attachment with a malicious macro, which then dropped and downloaded TrickBot. TrickBot, one of the very first things it did is it essentially turned off Defender antivirus, because again, back at this time, tamper protection was not there. Once Defender for AV was disabled, then Ryuk was downloaded, and that was basically the sequence. And so the lesson learned there, this is a while back, was if you don't have tamper protection enabled, if you can't prevent a loader or dropper from actually disabling AV, you might as well not even have AV. Because there's, obviously AV is important, but if it can just be disabled, then ransomware can do, anything it wants.
Yeah.
The other really interesting thing was once the attackers were in, and it was they gained entry on a outdated server that had, and sadly, I think probably 80% of organizations I talk to have some form of Windows server that is not getting security patches anymore. And so these servers end up kind of being these like beachhead kind of staging, zones for attackers. But the essentially what happened was, the customer had set up at the time ATA, or Azure ATP, which is the predecessor of Defender for Identity, and it was alerting them that, hey, we see past the ticket, we see past the hash, we see all this lateral movement, all this stuff going on. It is alerting the client, but because they didn't have a SOC, they didn't have a managed service provider looking at the alerts.
Mm,
They even if they did internally look at the alerts, they didn't have the skill of interpreting the alert. They
mm,
didn't know what to do with that data. Right. And so that really kind of goes into multiple other areas, which, even if you have the right systems alerting you, if you don't either have the team that understands it or a SOC that can, respond on your behalf, again, what good is that alerting system? Again, there's forensic value later because then we could kind of retrace how they got in, and there's certainly a lot of value there. But the big lesson learned for me on that one was you guys really need a SOC and you really need tamper protection. But yeah.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. MDE has come a long way since it first started. When it first came in the market, it was a little rocky, had some issues. You mentioned one of them. But man, it is really really come a much further distance. And what I would say is, just to kind of echo what you were talking about on the SOC side, I think where a lot of people get confused from a capabilities perspective is they attribute EDR with the outcomes that a SOC provides driving an EDR, thinking that the EDR by itself will
Mm,
accomplish that, but not realizing how much expertise and time and management is required to really get the full value out of it. And I think from that perspective, there's a lot of vendors out there that kind of play fast and loose with defining MDR versus SIM versus EDR, and it confuses the buyer, and at the end of the day, the businesses that are using and deploying those solutions, because a lot of them, it's a really simple conversation for you and I to have, like, hey,
mhm,
if you have EDR, if you need to establish an MDR like outcome for your organization, you need a SOC, whether it's your SOC or someone else's SOC. You
mhm,
need analysts taking those alerts, taking the intelligence that's available, and driving value out of those things, both through investigation and teeing up response.
mhm.
And I think a lot of people in general confuse those things, or they'll think that if they have a managed sim, it's the same thing as having a managed EDR product, and it's really not, and the two are providing two separate functions, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Great points. And I think if you're on, InfoSec Twitter, you've been seeing over the last couple of months a giant emphasis on EDR bypass techniques.
Hmm.
And what we're learning is even the best EDR systems, whether it's CrowdStrike or Microsoft or Sophos or any of the good ones out there, they can be bypassed. And there was a famous one I read about, as far as I know, still hasn't been really addressed, which is a DLL sideloading attack.
Hmm.
So you get, teams.exe in the same directory as a DLL that's been tampered with or injected. And when Teams loads, it's reading this DLL, which is no longer trusted. Teams.exe is now basically effectively functioning as a C2 beacon.
Hmm.
And any network analyst is going to be looking at traffic. Okay, that's Microsoft Teams. And so the only way that would really kind of throw it off is if Teams.exe was suddenly communicating with a different IP than normal. That, if you have some NetFlow kind of UEBA, kind of some anomaly detection, you might be able to detect that. But still, it's kind of like that SolarWinds attack. When you're looking at a trusted executable, like here we have Teams.exe, is that just Microsoft doing something a little bit differently? And if you hide that C2 traffic in a CDN, not many SOC teams, or maybe the really good ones, but not many are going to be able to spot that very quickly. So the point there is that none of the top EDR vendors were able to detect the DLL sideload. None of them. And this came out from I think it was the European Union study that came out that detected that was not being detected. I take it back. I think one of them did, and but it was like out of the 11 vendors, there was like one. But the point there is that you just said it. EDR in and of itself is not going to be the silver bullet. You really need all of these things together to really stand a chance right now, right? Yeah.
Yeah, well, and it really takes a layered approach. It's not just any one piece of tech, it's not just any one vendor, it's not just any one relationship. It's really arranging everything and having a security strategy as an organization, and having that be a present conversation with your executives and your board, and having them understand what decisions need to be made, and be a part of creating and translating that vision into action for their organizations. A lot of even mid-sized and enterprise firms aren't doing that.
Yeah.
um,
Yeah, and I think the mid-size firm, I'm glad you touched on mid-size. I think the mid-size firms are actually uh, they're not only small businesses getting hurt by ransomware and these kind of threats, but midsize in particular, because oftentimes they either don't have a dedicated security person yet. It's typically a generalist who's maybe kind of wearing that hat. I mean, that's we're starting to see that change where they might get like one person, but this same person now, Stephen, they're also not just responsible for security, but they're now also responsible for compliance. And they're getting overwhelmed with, okay, there's GDPR, there's CCPA, there's all this kind of new privacy law. There's all these considerations of, DLP and classification and all this stuff. And one person is supposed to be responsible for, security, reading all the alerts and implementing compliance solutions and doing implementations. That mid-sized company is in a tough spot from a staffing perspective,
Hmm.
not just finding the person, but retaining them. And this also leads to the conversation of, the market today, which is another, we could talk about that, after this. But w- what do you think? I mean, in terms of this challenge that mid-sized organizations are facing with, typically, small staff needing to juggle both security, now this giant compliance realm, which is being kind of put into the security mantra, that's secure,
Yeah, it definitely is, and we definitely see that a lot. I think the most common thing I see people struggle with, especially on privacy law, regardless of which privacy laws we're talking about, are things like right to forget, because
mm,
the sheer amount of engineering brain
mm,
power to action what needs to happen in a situation where right to forget is invoked in some cases is incredibly complex. Like when you have people with poorly managed email systems or data asset management systems that are not keeping track or siloing some of those things into consistent places.
yeah,
If you don't have a data management strategy, you're going to really be hurting when you get those requests, and
yeah,
that's like the tip of the spear for a lot of the bad things that can happen from a regulatory perspective too, right? So
yes,
it's a really complicated
it
problem.
is.
It's a landmine that's been put on security practitioners' laps in a lot of cases.
Yeah, and I think a lot of organizations were kind of waiting for someone to get sued and lose their shirt before they really kind of focused on these data subject requests for
Hmm.
GDPR and CCPA. But I would venture to say most of the clients I talk to are not ready. They don't even have an intake process of somebody for one of these citizens to contact to basically request a copy of their data or request the copy to be changed or request it to be deleted.
Hmm.
And so that's definitely a challenge. The funny thing, the irony is, let's just talk about the Microsoft toolset for a second. If I go into the Microsoft eDiscovery tool to perform a data subject request, which is essentially, somebody's requested a copy of all their data, they're entitled to it according to the
Hmm.
law now. People own their data. The business doesn't own it. The people own they have a right to their data.
Hmm.
So if I go to search for someone's name, Stephen, like let's say I search for your name, it's actually it's not an exact match. So what will happen is the results will return anyone with Stephen or Legg, and it's not a perfect match. The problem that happens then is then the result set that gets returned. If I don't go through that with a fine tooth comb and actually identify things I probably shouldn't share,
Hmm.
the irony is I could be in violation of that person's then GDPR rights or CCPA rights, because I've now shared their information with someone that I shouldn't have. And so that's an expensive thing for a business to staff up that position, the time, the amount of those requests coming in for these larger orgs, and that's a burden, I think, for businesses. But it's the new reality of doing business. It's the new cost of business now.
Yeah, I agree, but I think that's also why I think a lot of businesses smartly are moving towards solutions that have those features baked into them. That's why I think Microsoft made the right choice, and over the last really like year and a half, they've beefed up what you can accomplish in the compliance center
Right.
of their Office 365 portal, really across all of their cloud products. It's
Mm. Yeah.
Today it's a lot different than it was when it first started, where it was largely just context searching, right? Context
Right.
searching in strings without really good guardrails, and so you'd get situations exactly like you described, where you're accidentally unauthorized or disclosing unauthorized
Right.
information to the wrong party.
Yeah,
So,
that's a good point. So at the Ignite conference, which was just a few weeks ago, is at the beginning of November,
mm,
Microsoft announced a feature called privacy management, and it's a pretty large solution. But
mm,
one of the things I like about it is it gives a workflow for the worker to basically see all the search results, and they could tag and untag things that are relevant or not relevant, and it shows a contextual search of where the data was found. So it's the first thing I've seen from Microsoft that is actually a practical solution for a data subject request for GDPR and whatnot. But it is a higher license level, so
mhm.
that's going to now increase the cost for these organizations to acquire a tool like that. Because, like you said, the out of the box tool, the content search, is is not designed at scale to handle a process like this, to be able to give someone their data. It really is not. You really need this new, in my opinion, a tool like that, or a third party tool. Yeah.
Well, yeah, you almost have to be prepared to do data mining on your own stuff, right? Like
Right.
that's the reality. You need tools
Right.
that can subdivide, filter, give you intelligent results, and filter out some of those false positives
Mhm.
without having to require a lot of analyst intervention on your end. Otherwise, you're ending up,
That's right.
you're staffing a whole team just to do this one function. And like
It's
when
yeah,
sorry,
totally.
I was just gonna say, as a mid-sized firm, that's not a tenable
Yeah.
thing for most people.
And so I think what's going to happen is this is going to drive retention policies to reduce the amount of data that people are keeping, because then that's less that can be then discovered or have to be shared and whatnot. And that's something very few organizations have done, because there's a risk where if I delete data, is that going to hurt my business, right? Could I have used that asset? um, and so then you get in the situation of somebody's got to then tag or label documents as a record, or hey, this needs to persist. Well, okay, now that's putting additional workload on people that just want to get their job done. Now they're responsible for tagging or labeling, and maybe they don't have an incentive to do that. So it's this compliance issue, especially my pity is really for that mid-sized firm who just doesn't have the staff, or they've got this overworked person. I just picture them all the time. I talk to this is like my classic client, right? Is
Hmm.
these folks are I think what we're going to see, Stephen, is probably a shift. If it hasn't already happened, I'd love if you've seen this in the market, is traditional MSPs starting to maybe help with these compliance areas. That's probably a market or a business need, because especially the small and mid, they're still by law required to deal with these same issues. I think if you're over like 5 people, you got to deal with these same laws, right?
Yeah. Well, and even those five-person firms still have their own privacy concerns because of GDPR and
That's right.
CCPA and all the legislation that's coming out, which is now, you know, my perspective is that's going to be commonplace everywhere. There's not going to be any exceptions anymore,
Mhm.
and not too many years from now. But to your point and your ask, no, I do agree. I think that is definitely the way things are going, and really, I think the model it drives people at from like a staffing perspective is that where they're going to want to make their investments are not in practitioners. They're going to want to outsource the practitioner roles. What they really need to invest in and harden up on and put a lot more emphasis on to have those better conversations are the key leaders that they need to achieve those things, right? Making intelligent hires for the CISO spot, for CIO, CTO, people that are owning the business IT strategy and security strategy and translating that into plans that are not half baked, right? A data management strategy that's not neglecting all the things you just described, right? If you fail to do that, you essentially have created two problems now that you have to solve. You have this debt that for these systems that were architected in a poor way, and then you have the present issue of the transactional uh, steps that need to be taken to fulfill on whatever requirement it is. So I think from that perspective, compliance definitely is driving a lot of it, but it all comes kind of full circle. I mean that's why. I mean, I don't need to tell you. That's why we partner with firms like Patriot and other MSPs to provide those functions because frankly there's just there's not enough people in the industry to fill those roles effectively. And
Right.
so the people that really are geared at doing it well and doing it at scale really need to be put in a position to kind of leverage that economy of scale for those end customers to get them into a better place.
Yeah, we just hired a lawyer on staff to be able to guide our clients. This morning, I was on a call with a casino, and they want to be able to delete data after 3 years, but tax documents they have to hold longer. So I had
Mhm.
our lawyer kind of join the call to kind of guide them because what's great is there's experience not just on the technology but on the legal side, and yes, that does increase our cost, but I think that provides a greater value to the client. To your point, when people don't have those inside counsel people to inform them,
Mhm.
that's one of the questions I get all the time. Is hey Joe, what should this policy be? My typical response is, well, what does your legal team say? And they kind of look around and legal team, the small firms don't have inside counsel. And the enterprises do, of course. But I think this problem, and it's really just not just security, but now compliance is these, and I guess I would define midsize as probably, on the small side, anything above maybe 250 or 500 seats, all the way up to maybe say 2,500 or 5,000. That's
Mhm.
probably midsize. Anything north of kind of 5,000, you're kind of really enterprise probably. I
Mhm.
know people define it differently, but there's not really a standard of defining those markets. But yeah, those size companies typically don't have inside legal counsel full time to guide them, right?
Well, and certainly, even if they have inside legal counsel, I see this a lot with customers that we do incident response engagements with. But often they'll have a general counsel inside, but that person won't have the training to deal with privacy issues, or to deal with security issues, or to deal with
Mhm,
breaches, or any
mhm,
of these relevant conversations that come up, whether it's in the form of drafting a data retention policy, data
mhm,
destruction, their management program, working with their technologists to set those policies in place and
mhm,
affect that stuff and then audit it. Like, they many times those general counsel staffers don't have that background, and so I think it's fantastic that you guys offer that. That's one of the reasons we partner with law firms as a part of the Antigen Partner Network, because we recognize, like, people just need this help sometimes. And so
right.
it's very forward thinking of you to do that and offer that. And I think that's definitely a value add that the market needs.
Yeah, one other challenge we're seeing a lot of our clients have is uh, there's this struggle, and you've seen this on Twitter, right? This is kind of a big topic
Mm.
of staffing. So you want a particular staff member, you put out the requirements, and there's some challenges there, right? And so the I guess I have a couple of questions for you, Stephen. Why are employers not hiring unqualified people? Which is kind of a funny rhetorical question, right? Like, why not take the risk? So, Stephen, like, let me kind of put you on the spot. So, someone applies to you, right? They
Hmm.
got their security plus, and hey, they want to go be a pen tester, or they want to go do something. Why not give them a chance? And and I'm asking kind of the employer side of you. And the reason I think this conversation is really interesting is because I want people to kind of understand the business side of things, like why
Hmm.
an employer might not take that risk, because you only ever see one side of it on Twitter. It's always like, oh, the employers are unfair, they don't hire unqualified people, why not take the risk? Well, let's hear the business side of it.
Well, I'll tell you, we answered that problem in some specific ways for the very reasons you're kind of touching on at a high level. And that is, at the end of the day, in terms of guaranteeing a consistent result and having people be independent and able to function and succeed as individuals, you're not setting untrained, untested resource up for success, putting them in a seat they don't belong in. Right? That's only going to cause issues for your customers. That's going to cause issues for them. They're going to be stressed and losing their mind every day, and it really just kind of taxes the whole ecosystem that they're inserted into. But I
Right.
do think it's important to give opportunities to people that may not necessarily meet qualifications for even entry level jobs, by creating really good internship programs and opportunities, and working with folks like Microsoft, who have training programs for everything from vets to
Mhm,
at-risk communities to all different
mhm,
kinds of folks. And I think that's one of the keys is setting up a path for those people that does work and will accommodate them. But like from an operational maturity perspective, your organization has to be pretty advanced to the point where you can carry that weight and deal with the operational overhead and issues that come up, because when you're learning on the job, the practical reality that no one really wants to talk about on infosec Twitter is that you're going to make mistakes, and that when
Right.
you're in security, those mistakes could cost somebody some money or
Mhm.
cause a lot of pain depending on what it is.
That's right. And when your clients come to you, they're probably not saying, give us your junior person that doesn't, I mean, that's not what they're asking. I've never heard a client ever say, hey, it's really amazing what you're doing by hiring people that, just pass their security plus
Yep.
and can I get that person, please? I want them to learn on my dime. No one asks for that, right? And so it puts us in I think a tough spot sometimes where, we do want to help, right? We do want to provide opportunities, but it comes at it's an investment. We're the ones kind of bearing that cost and that risk. And I think that's kind of the unmentioned, as you mentioned, as things that people aren't really talking about. It's the employer that has to take the risk and spend the cost. Now, I think that the group that figures that out really well is going to be ahead of the game, because if you do have sort of this intake program, this incubation program to kind of build up people, and you train them your way with your methods, right?
Mhm.
You can mold people into a way where they don't come with some of the baggage and issues, or patterns that have been learned the wrong way and whatnot. So there's some advantage there. Also, I think it's likely that if you treat people right, you'll get some loyalty, some long-term retention if you have a
Mhm.
good culture and a good workplace. But those are, other issues. Retention is probably the biggest problem or challenge, in security today, because anyone can come along, offer them 20% more. Uh, it's a tough marketplace to be in professional services today.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. And I think the people that will pull ahead, one, will do what you said, but two, importantly, and this is a really kind of simple takeaway, the people that will succeed at this are the people that will be willing not just to take it on, but to create a path for people. I think the mistake a lot of employers make in general with technical roles is that they expect somebody to come in and then be complacent in that role forever and just stay in the same seat forever. And nobody wants that. Literally, everyone wants to progress. Everyone wants to see and feel the progression over time. And without or lacking that progression, it creates issues with loyalty, with performance, with morale. It can start to affect other employees. Like it becomes a cultural problem. And so that's why
Mhm.
I think, you know, I think you're right, but I also think the balance to be struck this to be struck there is, you know, definitely be sober about who you're hiring, definitely position yourself and your customers for success, and definitely try to give opportunities to people that are deserving,
Mhm.
that maybe don't, on paper meet every requirement, but you got to temper that with setting the right tone, setting the right culture, and creating a successful path for every employee. Because otherwise, the employee and the outcomes that they would produce for you are what's at risk, right? And their quality of life, their lifestyle.
Right.
So, at the end of the day, I think it's easy to forget about all those other pieces, but it's good to chat about it a little bit,
Yeah.
and peel back the veil, because it gets, man, infosec Twitter can be very toxic. It's real crazy, especially on this topic, because there's
Yeah.
there's a lot of great work that people want to do with communities that absolutely deserve those opportunities. It's just, how do you make that happen, but also at the end of the day still get the job done, right?
Yeah, yeah, and it's like I said, I think there's wherever there's a challenge, there's an opportunity for someone who can see a path, into creating that. And no, I think you touched on some things there that totally agree with. I think the larger organizations, like say Microsoft, they made 40 billion, cash profit. They've got some money to be able to carry the weight and
Mhm.
help out, right? So I think the larger orgs definitely, I think, have some more responsibility to share there. One other challenge I think that's come up, some of my clients have shared with Stephen, is really around the the higher barriers and the rising difficulty to obtain cybersecurity insurance today.
Hmm.
I had lunch with a client last week, and they were telling me that their cybersecurity insurance cost doubled. So, I mean, we're talking, a couple $100,000 for cybersecurity insurance, which is significant. And they also said that the difficulty to even get it, um, you know, even if like one MFA, one account was enabled for MFA, wasn't good enough. The
Hmm.
insurers are actually getting to be quite sticklers at this because they have a lot to lose now, right?
Yeah, no, they absolutely do, and that's a trend we've seen across the cyber insurance industry really the last 2 years. Ever since ransomware and other cybercrime have ramped up, and there have been more payouts, the numbers that I get from our cyber insurance partners are something like, in some cases when it was really bad, they were paying for every dollar they were making on a policy, they were paying at least $5 worth of payouts to those policyholders just because of the sheer volume of activity. And that's really untenable for the insurer also, right? And it's not setting anyone up for success. So I think I think your point is really valid and very accurate. And what I would say is what we're seeing is even things as unusual as insurers reaching out to policyholders mid-term and saying things like, "Hey, we know you reported to us that you have an on-premise Exchange server, or you reported to us that you have this legacy system. If this system was, recently reported to have this X, Y, or Z vulnerability, if you don't address this in 2 weeks, you lose your coverage. Good luck."
Wow, I had not heard that that's happening. Wow, that's but I think that's legit. I mean, if people, can't put up the bare minimum, why should the insurance company have to take a loss? I mean, they're in business too, so I can definitely see their side of it, and I think it is reasonable to patch within. I- I'm telling clients now you got to patch within 3 days because um, if you remember Marcus, who's the guy who came up with the backdoor for WannaCry.
Hmm.
I recall on Twitter where he reverse engineered a DHCP vulnerability in 3 days. Microsoft released a patch. He basically went in, debugged it, looked at the code and said, okay, I think it's doing this. Okay, I'm going to write an exploit. So he literally had an exploit within 3 days
Hmm.
of the DHCP vulnerability being announced or released. And so if you have, DHCP is a bad example because it's not internet facing, but if you had an internet facing vulnerability and you're not patching within a few days, that people with that level of, skill are out there that can reverse engineer it. And that's just for the vulnerabilities that are publicly known. There's this
Hmm.
whole other topic which we haven't really touched on, these zero-day marketplaces where people, there's dozens of these companies now. I thought it was just a few, like NSO Group. I just saw a tweet the other day that actually listed a ton of them. There's a lot of companies out there selling these exploits to the highest bidder, which that's happening, right? So
It's pretty crazy, and I like a lot of the topics that we're talking about, we could probably spend an entire session just on the zero-day vulnerabilities and marketplaces that exist now. Um, I think the takeaway for people is that really what this is signaling is that there needs to be a change in the market. And that's why I said that you're really smart for including legal counsel in your practice and as a part of the consulting that you guys do, because like that's directly what we're trying to solve with the Antigen Partner Network and with partners like you, because we recognize that if you don't have the stage set ahead of time, if you don't know all these things, if you haven't positioned yourself to know and be able to say, hey, yeah, we patch within 48 hours or 24 or 72 or whatever it is, you are not going to make it when the bad day comes.
mhm.
It's going to cost you so much more money, so much more time. It's going to have so much more negative impact to your business, whether that's in brand damage, reputation, being unable to fulfill on customer obligations, whatever. It really does put you behind the eight ball as an organization. And so I think the more time goes on, the more we're going to see collaboration, greater collaboration, I hope. And what we hope to drive is greater collaboration, but between all of these parties that really should be talking, ahead of any kind of bad day that might come up. Because if you, again, if the cost of failure is massive, right? And that's why the insurers are shifting things the way that they are, because they recognize that their risk models are telling them that. And so now they're translating that into action and changing the way that they sell to their policyholders. I think in terms of really kind of breaking that apart a little bit more, um, one thing I'd love to get your thoughts on is what you're seeing in terms of kind of more wide scale adoption of security technologies. A lot of times my experience with MSPs and technology providers or service providers in general is that they will often offer point solutions only, or discuss things from the perspective of a point solution for a given problem, but they're not having those strategic conversations. What do you see as the opportunity there for service providers, and where do you think uh, the best ones are going to pull ahead?
I think you kind of touched on a little bit earlier when you're talking about leadership that actually can look at things holistically. So those CISOs and those really strategic thinkers, if organizations lack that, I think MSPs that want to pull ahead are going to need to staff that. And I know you guys actually offer that virtual kind of CISO kind of service to be able to help people think strategically, not just a point solution over here, but like all the layers in defense need to be in place to have an effective security strategy. So I think you guys are actually well positioned. I think you guys are actually ahead of the game, because when I look at various websites, various kind of partners and consultancies out there, very few actually have that. And you guys can definitely hang in there with the best of them when it comes to those kind of levels of conversations. So I think that's the key, is being able to provide a service like that.
Got it. Yeah, no, I think strategic leadership is definitely a pain point for the modern larger end of SMB, smaller end of enterprise especially. Those are the organizations that often have identity crises around that, because they're not actively managing those conversations, right? They don't have that leader or a service provider that can help
Right.
supplement that leadership.
And it's kind of interesting from a political perspective. There's always politics in every company, right?
Hmm.
Not many people want that CISO role because they're the first to get fired if there's any kind of security incident. So
Hmm.
by outsourcing it, it's actually very smart politically. So if you're a CIO and you're a CEO and you don't have a CISO role, you might want to think twice about like wearing that hat, because they typically, what is the average turnover of a CISO? It's not long. It's like a year or two, right, before they're out, because typically they're to blame when there's like a security incident. By outsourcing that, you actually have someone to kind of, blame. It kind
Hmm.
of, politically is actually a pretty smart move, I think, for a lot of these organizations to consider that virtual CISO.
It is definitely smart. I think the only piece of caution I would give is really pay attention to the way that your third parties structure their agreements around virtual CISO or any kind of outsourced leadership positions. Because a lot of times, from a liability perspective, they'll put layers of protection between themselves and those nasty end results. And so you want to make sure, if you're doing something to have a throat to choke, make sure you actually have a throat
Right.
to choke. Don't
Yeah.
don't set
Yeah.
yourself up to not have that.
Yeah, and so not so much from a liability, because you're right, they'd be protected, there, but more of like a job security thing. Like
Oh
if you
yeah.
step into that CISA role, you have to know, like, the clock is kind of ticking on, because the security incident is now a matter of when, not if. And
Correct.
it's actually, in all likelihood, in a lot of these organizations, it's already happening right now. You have to assume breach. You have to assume that a threat actor is already in there, and you have to be hunting. And most organizations, the small to medium sized organizations, don't have the staff or the budget to be actively hunting for that assumed breach mindset. And I would say that 30 to 50% of organizations or higher probably still don't have the assumed breach mindset.
Hmm.
They probably think they're fine, and they're not.
Well, it's because they're not having cybersecurity conversations at the senior level, most likely.
Right.
It's crazy. Yeah, it's what's interesting about that is that assumed breach as a concept has been around now for quite a while.
Hmm.
And it's been in business circles for quite a while. Not even just in, because there's lots of things that don't make it out of InfoSec Twitter, right? Like lots of research, lots of useful nuggets and tidbits and takeaways that I'm sure would be useful to a lot of people. But in terms of what is the public conversation, it really has been there. And so at this point, your comment before about how this is the cost of doing business now, it truly is just that. Either you care about those things and you're getting ahead of them and making the investments and having the conversations you need to have to position your organization for success in those circumstances, or you're not, and you're suffering from it. You're almost always in one of those two buckets. Very rarely is somebody just good, and rolling along and doing fine without any oversight. That is a rarity at this point, I would say.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. It's so bad out there. I was in the last day. I've talked to 2 different clients that are just dealing with successful phishing attempts just every day, because there's now these. I'm sure you've seen these like double layer attacks where the email comes in, it's a PDF hosted on OneDrive, but then the PDF takes you to a link to somewhere else. And so most detonation chambers kind of have this recursion limit where they're not going to just keep infinitely kind of detonating, right? And so there's a technology issue, but there's also the human issue of people clicking on things they shouldn't. And so it is it is basically taking depending on the size of the organization, full-time people dealing with these to go, okay, this just happened. Okay, how bad is it? What actually happened on the endpoint? Do we see indicator? And so, the amount of time and effort to facilitate an assume breach mindset is significant. And I don't know if there's some people out there that are just like pretending the problem's not there so that they don't have to. I don't know, but they're gonna pay. Like eventually, it's kind of like tech debt.
Yep.
Technology debt exists. It's real. Like if you have an upgrade, if you're still on like Windows 7, oh, you're gonna pay. It's you think you're saving money. No, it's coming. The bill's coming. It's just not in the way you think it's coming, right?
Yep. Yeah, but that's what's funny about it. And Joe, I know, we got to wrap up. We could probably talk all day, but we got to wrap up soon. But what I was going to say about that last point is, couldn't agree more. I think from a technical debt perspective, the gotcha that people always don't think about is they assume, or rather, the decision that they make in their head is, if they accept that a legacy system exists, often they stop thinking about how to secure it at the point where they go, okay, it's vulnerable, it's going to be vulnerable, bye, we're
Yeah,
done, we're just
yeah,
leaving it online. They don't talk about microsegmentation, they
right.
don't talk about any other kind of compensating controls, or
Hmm. Hmm.
changing the architecture of their network so that it's insulating those
Hmm.
vulnerable systems a little bit more. They're just not thinking through those things through. And again, I think it's because they lack that kind of strategic leadership, whether it's on the
Right.
security or the technology side.
Brilliant. No, I think there's probably enough there on that topic alone to justify another fireside chat in the future to get into culture and whether people feel like they can bubble up those concerns to their executive leadership, and if those people will listen. I mean, there's so much there, right? No, this has
Yeah.
been really fun. Thank you so much for having me on. Really, this is great.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate you joining, Joe, and thank you so much for coming out. We'll have to do another one in the not too distant future, sir.
Sounds good. Sounds
All right.
good.
You
All right.
take care.
Thank you. All right. Take care.
Hi.
Hey, how'd it go?
It's good. Streamed. Did the thing.
Awesome. Oh, we're still on.
What?
I still see us on YouTube.